getting these amazing writers to talk today. I'm a writer from Nepal. I live in Toronto right now, but I go back and forth. And all of the writers here have experienced movement in some form or another, either through migration, displacement, or travels of all kinds. Today's session seems to be very timely in light of this massive exodus that's going on in the world, unprecedented in scale since the Second World War. It's something that recalls Homi Bhabha's saying that exodus, that the in-betweenness that we all have is a fundamental nature of our lives now. So I want to have all of us talk about this in different ways. We all write different kinds of books, and so I'm going to start just by talking to each writer individually, and then we'll break it into a conversation. Let me start with Anchee Min. Anchee, you're the author of 8 novels, including bestsellers like Red Azalea. My favorite is Becoming Madame Mao and The Empress Orchid. Now, your story is as dramatic as any of the stories in your novels. You came to the US at a very young age. You didn't have any English. You learned English and became a writer. So could you talk, to begin with, about your own journey as an individual from a child in China to a writer in the United States?
My journey. I was born in China, 1957. I was taught to write Long Live Chairman Mao before I was taught I could write my own name. And I grew up, wanted to be, I was pretty much like everybody else, become a young communist. I wanted to die for sacrifice myself for the world peace, save the world. And then I went through the Cultural Revolution. So I was raised by the Communist Party and lived in China for 27 years. At age of 17, I was like a 1/3 of China, sent to the countryside, my labor camp near East China Sea, where I served as a laborer. I grow rice and cotton and carry manure. 1976, early, we did not know that Mao was dying, and Madame Mao was planning to take over China, and she wanted to make a campaign movie to pave her way, and she was looking for a face to lead the propaganda film to pave her way. And I was hoeing in the cotton field when the talent scout came, and they found everything, my face, my body, figure, to their liking. Sent me so I was ordered and put on the tractor first, and then on the military truck to the Shanghai Film Studio for, became elected, did all the screen tests, so to do the film. And the same year, September 9th, 1976, Mao died. October 8th, Madame Mao was arrested and overthrown, and 2 months later, I was denounced. So that was my dark age. I was driven to the point of committing. It's a long story. Anyway, how I get to America, after 8 years, it was either die in China, I was coughing blood, or try. And then I learned that there was a friend in America was working her way as a student, pay her own tuition. And so I asked if I could be a student. So I pretty much fake, I wouldn't say fake. It's the immigrant, you do what you have to do to, I became an artist because I just, I did some paintings and then applied at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and was accepted based on my art. And I didn't speak English, but I had somebody else fill the application form. Then borrow the money, and I started the journey October, no, 1984, September 1st, I landed in America and immediately got caught and put in the room for deportation. And that's a long story. I'll probably just tell you the next session. And then in America, I started as an author, you know, thinking back, it's such a great opportunity that I started from the bottom of America society. I worked 5 jobs on my way. 10 years later, I compete on the literary competition and won, and then it was part of Red Azalea. From there on, I became an American author and produced 2 memoirs and the rest.
Incredible story, huh? It brings to mind something that we've been thinking about a lot, which is so many people have to move or migrate because of disasters, whether it's natural disasters of the kind that Nepal has had recently, or political disasters of the kind that you've been through and the world is seeing right now with Syria. Prajwal, I want to ask you, now you are yourself a hybrid. You have one parent from Nepal, another parent from the Nepali parts of India. You say that you've lived in the UK, US, and Missouri. Right now you're based in Missouri. But you're also very rooted in Gangtok and in the Nepali society there. So your 2 books, The Gorkha's Daughter and Land Where I Flee, they both kind of reflect this multiculturalism that you yourself have, and this ease of moving back and forth between Gangtok, Nepal, the West, New York. How important is it for you to be rooted, or to be part of this? I mean, how does that come into your creative process, being rooted in Gangtok or in the Nepali society there?
Oh, excellent. I come from the state of Sikkim in India, and Sikkim was an independent kingdom until 1975. We had an American queen. It's weird. Fifth Avenue debutante, a New Yorker, goes to Darjeeling on vacation, ends up getting married to the king of the nation. So, that's a migration of a different kind there. All right, and so I grew up in Sikkim with a Nepalese mom, a Nepali-speaking Indian father, right next to Bhutan. And writing about this world was a very, very natural thing to do for me, because it was my world. I mean, the Nepali world had been written about by people like Manjushree and Samrat before me, but there had been no one representing the Indian Nepali world, which is why I decided to do the writing. How important is it for me to be rooted in that culture? It's bizarre that I can only write my books when I'm in Gangtok. I travel all over the world. I flit from literary festival to literary festival, like my life depends on it. But when the actual writing happens, it doesn't happen in a coffee shop in New York. It doesn't happen in London. I have to go back to Gangtok. I have to see the mountains there, which I go up to my parents' terrace and then try to look at the Kanchenjunga changing hue on a daily basis. So, I mean, that should give you an idea of how important it is for me to be rooted in the place, in the culture, when it comes to writing my books. I will say I'm sick and tired of writing about the Nepali-speaking world now, so maybe not being in Gangtok will help. But it's extremely important to me.
Maina Singh, now you come at these themes from a more academic angle. You're teaching right now at the American University in Washington, D.C., and your area of focus is identity in diaspora communities. One of your studies is particularly unusual, and the one that really struck my fancy was your study into the migration narratives of the Indian Jewish community. Could you introduce the audience here to the community of the Indian Jewish community, and talk a little bit about your research into their migration to Israel, and what for you was the passion behind doing a study on them?
Right. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and thank everybody who's responsible for organizing this, the movers and shakers in India and the movers and shakers here in Boulder. So Manju, I'll answer inverted, picking up the last part of your question first, which is what brings me to it. I'm not a hybrid. I'm Indian. I grew up in India. I'm not an immigrant. When my mother named me after a bird, I don't think she realized that I would have to make a home in 7 different countries across 4 different continents. In Ethiopia, in Israel, in Russia, in America, in Japan, and so on and so forth. Displacement has been a part of my life. Among the most enriching things has been being able to connect with different Indian diaspora communities. That has opened up a whole other world of identity. What I shared with the diaspora communities was an Indianness. What I did not share was the way that homeland, identity, and belonging were ambivalent, and are ambivalent in most diaspora communities. That was not for me. Citizenship, belonging, home was always in India. I'm a diplomat's wife, so I did not share the same sort of notions and understandings of home. It's been ever so enriching to be able to have access to the narratives of many who did not find voice themselves. And 2 of the communities that I've been involved with most recently have been, one, the Indian Jews in Israel, and the second, more recently, is people of Indian origin in the French Caribbean in Guadeloupe. Guadeloupe and Martinique have huge populations of Indian origin. They are descendants, 7th generation descendants of the indentured labor. So that's a migration tied to colonialism. They look like us, but they speak French or they speak Creole. They keep looking for their lost homes and their, some lineage back in Uttar Pradesh and India, and they're not able to find it. It's a whole other aspect. But Manjushree, now coming back to my most recent book, which is on the Indian Jews in Israel, I discovered, living in Israel, that there were people who were of Indian origin who were 80,000. And 80,000 in Israel, in a population of 7 million, is not to sneeze at. And yet, they didn't seem to fit into the stereotype of the Indian diaspora, engineer, doctor, physician, academic. They were in middle-level jobs. They also had a very, very warm sense of the homeland they had left behind. These are Indians who 3 different communities have lived across, 3 different Jewish communities have lived in different parts of India, and they trace back their narratives to 2,000 years ago, after the destruction of the Second Temple. And one of the narratives is that they got shipwrecked, and 7 men and 7 women were washed off the coast of the Konkan coast, west of Bombay. And they became the Bnei Israel community, and they still have their synagogues there and so on. So I was more interested in what happened in the post-migration scenario as they became Israeli. What would happen within the Ashkenazi-Sephardi divide? How would the color bias play out? How would stereotypes of, oh, these Jews come from underdeveloped countries, their levels of education are low, how would that make representatives of the state send them off to areas like Yarukham and Dimona and in the desert, in the Negev desert, where there was almost no development? How is it that so many educated Indians didn't really get into the Ulpan and learn Hebrew very quickly and just join nation building in the front lines? That didn't happen. And even to this day, people would say to me in Israel, are there really 80,000 Indian Jews? They are. They're scattered. In the north, on the Lebanese border, they're there in the Kochini origin, they are there in the Moshavim, they are there in the Moshavim in the Negev. But in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, I didn't find prominent Indian Jewish communities. So that was what led me to explore issues of identity, gender, and issues of homeland and belonging for the Indian Jewish community in Israel.
fascinating. I mean, it's not a community that we hear very much about, or certainly not the community in Israel. We hear about the Jewish community in India a little bit. Now, my own writing, as I said, I'm from Nepal. One of my novels is actually called Seasons of Flight, and I'm very much a hybrid, like, maybe not like Maina, like the rest of us. One of the things that I've written about a lot as a non-fiction writer is the constant sort of political disaster in Nepal. And as a fiction writer too, it's been really important for me to write about political themes. I want to go back to Anchee and ask you, you write about, these massive political disasters that have happened, some of the biggest disasters in the world, and you write novels about them, you write fiction about them. I know many writers, particularly in America, I find, are very afraid of writing about large political themes, or they really choose not to, and they tend to focus on small personal stories. How do you write about politics and political events in such a way that personalize it? How do you bring out the human story and not get lost in the politics? How do you do that?
It was convenient. Red Azalea was my 27 years of life in China as a commoner. I'm from a family, like a middle and lower class families. My parents, as I knew them, my mother worked in the rain boot shoe factory. Her job was to pick the shoes off the mold, and she had a tuberculosis. Her parents, my grandmother died at age 49, my grandfather died at age 55. And so it was like that. And then my dad worked for a printing shop. So it was, I got yelled at by a lot of Chinese, nice people, PhDs. I said, I had no right to write all these terrible things about China. Why can't I write some elite class, of China stories? And I used a Pearl Buck fight with, when she wrote The Good Earth. She had a fight with the Chinese professor at the Princeton, and they had a fight on the New York Times. And the Chinese professor says, why do you pick why can't you pick the 5% of Chinese elite to write about? And Pearl Buck says, that's the point. So that's my point about Red Azalea. And I became Madame Mao, and it was just, I wonder why my face, why pick me? Why I had to be the face of China, why I did not know her, and all the rest of my life because of this goddamn face. And then after her downfall, and I was out of fashion. So I wanted to learn about that and her story, crazy. And then Empress Orchid, the last empress, was about what I can contribute to America. I thought, you guys, I'm sorry, you don't know China, the China I know. And how I think where China is coming from is important in order to predict where China is going, that you guys are dying to know. So Empress Orchid was a convenient character, and she single-handedly hold China for 50 years, and she went through the 2 Opium War when the British was trying to shovel opium into China's throat, and that became a kind of mindset, and that things that went into in our blood, that we deserve the invasions, we deserve to be taken over, we even deserve the Japanese mass killing in rape of Nanking, because we thought we were too civilized to be invaded. So if you're not strong in defense, and that's what you get. And so China is right now, as you see, crazy about self-defense, but it never bothered to explain itself. So that just gave me this panic thing about China. And my father still lives in China, so I visit China every year.
It's interesting, earlier when you were talking, you used the word immigrant, that you came over as an immigrant and you had this sort of spirit or the need to survive. I want to ask Prajwal this question. I feel like one of the things that in the American literary context that happens is the literature written by immigrant writers, such as yourself, is often more political than the fiction written by people who have been settled here for a longer time. And it's often understood as immigrant fiction. Now, I feel like there's a younger generation who's coming up now, and I feel like Prajwal is part of this, who has grown up all over the world, didn't migrate from one place to the US, and is very comfortable moving around. Do you feel that this sort of, I don't know if there's a term for it, a sort of globalized fiction is something that you're part of, or do you identify with that, or do you consider yourself an immigrant writer, or do you consider yourself an Indian writer? How do you identify yourself?
A global writer. Only because, I have this book called Land Where I Flee, where siblings living in various parts of the world, one in Boulder, Colorado, one in New York, and one in London, convene in my hometown, or my Himalayan hometown of Gangtok, Sikkim, for their grandmother's 84th birthday. So these are not people who have decided they're going to live in America or in England. They are open to the idea of moving back home. They're also open to the idea of moving countries. It's not like they have established roots anywhere and that these roots can't be dismantled. So they mirror who I am in so many ways. I am as comfortable in London as I'm in New York, as I'm in India. And this entire concept of where do you live is alien to me, as it is to so many international writers like me, because we honestly don't know where we live. It's you asked me that yesterday at the party. Where exactly do you live, Prajwal? And I have been living in Missouri for the past month and a half, and that's the longest I've lived in a place in 4 years. I'll be there for another six weeks or so. I think labels like immigrant fiction help sell fiction to a considerable extent, and there is a purpose to those labels. If it helps sell your books, why not? But I definitely consider myself a global writer. I do. Yeah. Calling myself an Indian writer would be meandering into dangerous territory, because what if 5 years from now I decide to write a book completely removed from the Indian or the Nepali context?
Do you have to have Indian content to be an Indian writer?
Well, often, more often than not, you do. I think you do. Name an Indian writer who doesn't write about India. Oh, yeah.
A new genre.
There you go. Good. I just thought of Rana Das Gupta, actually. Yeah, there is someone out there. But, I do not want to...
There's an Equal Music by Vikram Seth.
Oh, yeah, Vikram Seth. Yeah, that's another one. Yeah. So, there are people out there.
You can be Indian and
yeah.
You don't have to give it up to.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Maina, I wanted to ask you, so you've studied the Indian community in the US also in terms of how they've established themselves politically. How does the Indian diaspora community around the world, so all of these different communities that you've studied, how do they figure in the Indian imagination in India? Do they figure at all? Because I know that they, I've seen the Indian community in Toronto where I live, and they identify very strongly with India and with their Indian roots, but I'm not sure that India really holds them in much consciousness, back home. What is their position in India, the diaspora?
Right. So I think it's difficult to put various Indian diaspora communities in the same bowl and say how are they remembered. So I'll just give a couple of examples. For instance, the descendants of the indentured labor who are in Suriname, Fiji, Mauritius, etc., or the French Caribbean no one seems to know about. People do know the Mauritian Indians, or maybe some of the Fiji Indians, but typically more in the state conferences and the Pravasi Bharati events that are held every year. I don't think people who live in UP and Bihar are so conscious that 7 generations ago there were these Indians. They sort of vaguely know that. Now, that's something to do with the play of history, perhaps, or time. Then I want to come to the post-colonial diaspora and the migration out of India, say, to the UK and the US, which I would broadly, for convenience, bracket between, say, the mid-50s and the late 60s, when large numbers of Indians came out looking for basically economic mobility in the UK and the US. And I would say that's much more a part of the consciousness because people have relatives. So there'll be the Gujaratis, there will be the Punjabis, and there are lots of relatives. Then there's this other diaspora, which is now really work in progress, which is the tech people who've come on the H-1B visas and are now gradually spread across America, not only in the usual suspect hubs like New Jersey, Chicago, New York, but Minnesota, San Jose, and there are large communities there, Pittsburgh. They have very active relationships. So let's also remember that, when they were coming in the late 80s or the early 90s, this is a whole generation where the families are FaceTiming with the parents in Bangalore and Trichur and something else, and Skype is on Saturday morning, and mom, show me how to do the sambar, and it's a whole other concept altogether. And they're showing the babies and saying, now, call Acha and call Chechi and so on and so forth. So it's a very real-time connection. It's like 7 in the morning in California, 7 in the evening in Bangalore, and it's all really convenient. So I would say different segments of the diaspora resonate differently. Let's also not forget about the migrant labor communities in the Gulf, because the West Asia has several million people of Indian origin, and they have been very, very strong in terms of their economic impact, because the lifestyles and the standards of living of families across Kerala have changed hugely with the remittances. In fact, the state itself has been very conscious of the role of remittances since that phase in the 1990s, when there was an outreach to say, invest in India. And so the diaspora has come to mean very different things. I also want to end by saying that what has been happening with the diaspora in relation to the Prime Minister Modi events that's been happening has made global headlines. So when people show up in thousands and thousands in Madison Square Garden, and then the TV channels in India are doing a real-time broadcast, and New York Times is splashing all that, well, then the connections between the diaspora and India just sort of, even if it's not somebody you know there, it's like, oh, our Indians? So it's interesting what's happening.
It's, my experience with the Nepali community is much smaller, the diaspora. In a way, there's a clearer sense of a Nepali community at least in Canada, because the Indian community is so large that it really does seem like the Gujarati or the Punjabi, or it breaks into regional groups rather than like one Indian community. It's sort of interesting to observe. I want to go back to Anchee. Now, your movements have not just been between places and histories and societies, but also languages. You mentioned just a little bit earlier to me that you're thinking of writing your next book. Maybe you've already started it in Chinese. Can you talk about what it's like to move from one language to becoming an English writer, and now, but you're more comfortable actually in your native tongue?
I like to respond with 2 points. Point 1, I see myself as an American writer because it's the American me. I would never write Red Azalea if I did not have established the American perspective, American mindset, American liberation, the transformation in me, because I was so ashamed would reveal anything like I revealed in Red Azalea. For example, my so-called affair with my commander in the labor camp, and an American put me in the radio, and after my interview, and had somebody, a psychiatrist, specialized in homosexuality, and I never heard of the word. I did not understand what that meant, homosexuality, but I knew that in the labor camp, when a young man, a woman, if they have any relationship, and the punishment of that could be execution. And it happened to us. And when woman forbidden to date a man, and you're emotional, you need a place, you need a home, you need a connection to survive. And so I learned the portrait of God, and learned that the love beyond gender just by accident. And that there's nothing shameful to that. And that really was a American new thing, American thing that started coming and take a root in me. And as I was learning English and translating, I think I was American, educated at the same time. And for me, it was because I lack language, and it's just all image. After the Cultural Revolution, in my second memoir, the sequel to Realizelia de Coxie, I mentioned this image of the hand, of my commander's hand. She came and visit me, and she wear this laced glove, fishnet kind of, just to cover her labor camp damaged hands. That when we were in the labor camp, we spread the pig manure, we dig the canal, we pick cotton, right? Our hands all messed up, all cracked. It was just like a man's hand. So it's this image. And my second point was that all of a sudden I realized that I was so rich in wealth in terms of a writer, because I have gone through this stage. One was I tried to sound America, and I never managed to sound like America. Everything I said is like it's Chinese. And then the second phrase was I realized that I could take advantage of that. So once that opened, and I became so innovative about the niche that I have to learn to survive as an American writer, to compete in the American literary scene, and to get published. And that's the only way to go, is to get an Olympic gold medal. And silver medal, bronze medal, that does not count. So the way for me to get gold medal was to use that language, the Chinese, the pit of 5,000 years of pit. For example, people I say, so how do you describe, how do you write? In America, you say, show, don't tell. In Chinese, you just say, the wind showed its body through trembling leaves. I just go around and around. So I had a conversation with the author of English Patient, Michael Adagis, and we talk about, they talk about sexuality, and they talk about sensuality. And he just says, just go around, don't be clinic about it. And for me, it's a natural. Everything in China, even my name in China called Min Anchee, here I call Anchee Min. So if I manage that trick. So once I realized that language, that advantage that I could take, I think I just took off.
So do you think the book that you write in Chinese will be an American book?
I think it would be very much American, and the Chinese will be shocked to say, this is our material we are so familiar with, but it's being examined and looked at in a very different light, which would be exciting.
Interesting. We're running out of time, so I'm going to open it up for question and answers, although we do also, if there's any chance, want to listen to some readings. We only have 5 minutes. If there are any questions, please go ahead for any of the authors. And if not, we'll go to readings. There's a question. There we
go. This is a question for Anchee. So, were your books translated into Chinese? I mean, do people read them in China, or
None. I have none translated because Realizelia was banned, and when American movie director Oliver Stone wanted to turn Realizelia into a movie, and he went to China, China said, "We welcome you. Any topic you pick." And once he says, "I pick Realizelia, I'm in love with Realizelia," and then they say, we think you're going to spend a long time to revise the script, which means never gets made. You will never get approved. So no translation, but China's changing. 2011, I think, I wrote a Pro of China, pro-Buck, and China just beginning to realize that their only voice in the West still is nobody else but pro-Buck. And my book about her, they studied it, and I was not shy about, I was brought to denounce 1972, denounce Pro-Buck, because I still remember the line that she insulted the Chinese peasants. And not until 1994, I read the Girl thighs broke down sobbing, because she loved Chinese peasants, and she has such a love and respect and the compassion, everything. So China liked my book, and they say they choose my book, Pro of China, as one of the 10 books the Chinese government officially recommending the West under the title called Let's Get to Know China.
One more question.
Hello? I'll try to make it quick. A question for Maina Singh. In your studies of Indian diaspora communities and sort of navigating these transnational, to use Homi Bhabha's term, hybrid landscapes, I'm curious if there's a consciousnness of, I guess, for me personally, growing up in the United States, I'm very conscious of our modern and ancient, I think, political emphases on multiculturalism and inclusion. And these are really the organizing principles of our state and our society and our identity. And I think that that's been very empowering for me and allowed me to live in that kind of transnational space, going back and forth between India and the United States. And I'm wondering in your studies, whether it's in the U.S. or the Indian Jewish community, which I think is relevant given the very happy experience they've had in India, if that's been something that other communities have been conscious of and values that have been practiced in your research.
Whether you want me to compare with other diaspora communities or other Indian diaspora communities, and what you want me to compare. Sorry, go ahead and elaborate on your question a little bit more for me.
Okay. The other Indian diaspora communities retain this consciousness of our cultural traditions of pluralism and tolerance and inclusion, and has that helped people grapple with this transnational life and identity?
Right. So when you said our, I didn't know whether you meant yourself located in the U.S. or whether you meant the Indian heritage that gave that. So that's what I didn't know.
Indian heritage, generally.
I see, yes. Yeah, so certainly I found that a lot of the first generation speak about how a certain ordinariness about living in multi-faith communities has been something that made them very, very comfortable. So the Jews in particular were remarked saying that on Shabbat I couldn't turn off the lights, but my neighbor Sarita would just come in the evening and switch the light off for me, and she knew that I wasn't going to touch that switch because it was Shabbat. And they just said that they were not so conscious of the divides until they came to the US. In fact, one of them, to Israel. In fact, they would very often speak of their synagogue in Mumbai and say, "Main girja jati thi," and girja is the word for church. So for them to say that my synagogue was a church that I went to was in itself a very interesting metaphor that came up, because she was speaking to me in Hindustani and she'd use that word all the time. So I think the boundaries were not so sharp, and as many of them said, in small town India, they had not even heard of the Holocaust. So they were not aware. They said, we learned about many of these things from our Ashkenazi fellow citizens in the US. So they were not aware of those things because they lived in these communities in Cochin and Gujarat, Ahmedabad, and in Calcutta. They did their Jewish thing in their home, just like other people did other things. They were part of the celebrations that went on in the neighborhoods. But yes, I think that they said was something that they brought with them. How it plays out for other communities, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, for instance, if it's as simple when a Hindu migrant worker, I'm not sure that the experience is the same in, for example, the Gulf countries, whether the migrant labor is Hindu or Muslim. Do they deal with different realities? Do they feel less or more comfortable being Hindus or non-Hindus in Arab states? That I think would need a little more research. I'm not aware of that. But certainly the existence in multi-faith societies is something that they have brought along with them, that first generation. About the second, we'll have to watch and see.
Fascinating. I'm sorry we don't have time for more. If you're bursting with questions, please corner all of the authors and buy their books and force them to sign them.
Thank you so much.